Just after 7 in the morning, a member of Camilla's closest circle walked up to a side entrance she'd used hundreds of times before. She badged in the way she always did. The light stayed red. A second attempt, same result. A third, with a security officer now watching, visibly uncomfortable. By midday, 4 more people connected to Camilla's inner circle had the exact same experience at different entrances across the grounds. Nobody told them why. Nobody told Camilla either, at least not yet. William had given the order the night before, but why? Why do everyone dislike her?
If you look at the coronation footage, as the king and queen leave the thrones and head for the exit of Westminster Abbey on the coronation Saturday, you'll see that everyone bows and curtsies to the king, and no one moves a limb, a muscle, when Camilla passes.
The morning the doors didn't open. The woman at that side entrance had worked alongside Camilla for nearly 9 years, long before the coronation, long before any of this required formal protocol at all. According to someone familiar with how that morning unfolded, she didn't immediately assume anything was wrong. Passes occasionally glitch. Systems get updated overnight. She tried again, calmly, the way anyone would the first time something like this happens. It was the 3rd attempt, with a security officer walking over to check the reader manually, that told her this wasn't a technical fault. He looked at his handheld device, then back at her, then said something that several sources describe almost word for word since. He told her the access had been formally revoked, effective midnight, and that he didn't have further details to give her. That phrase, formally revoked, is doing a lot of work here. It's not the language used for a malfunction. It's the language used when someone, somewhere, made a deliberate decision, and that decision had already been entered into the system before she ever walked up to that door. She wasn't alone. Over the following 5 hours, according to people familiar with how the day unfolded, 4 other individuals connected closely to Camilla's personal and professional circle had the same experience at different entrances across the grounds. A longtime friend who frequently joined her for private lunches. A stylist who had worked with her for over a decade. 2 members of staff who managed correspondence and scheduling for her personal engagements, separate from the formal household office. 5 people, 5 different entrances. The same result, within hours of each other, on the same morning. That detail matters enormously because it rules out the most obvious innocent explanation almost immediately. A single failed pass might be a glitch. 5 across different access points, all tied to people connected specifically to one person's inner circle, is not a coincidence anyone inside that security operation would have missed. According to someone with knowledge of how palace access systems are typically managed, changes of this nature don't happen casually. Revoking someone's credentials requires a specific authorization, logged under a specific name, approved through a process that exists precisely to prevent exactly this kind of sweeping, simultaneous change from happening without deliberate intent behind it. The authorization on this particular batch of revocations traced back to William's office, not a junior aide acting on vague instructions. William himself, according to this account, having personally signed off on the change the previous evening with instructions that it be processed before staff arrived the following morning. That timing is worth sitting with. He didn't make this decision in the heat of some immediate confrontation. He made it the night before, deliberately, giving himself time to think it through, and chose to have it take effect quietly, overnight, rather than announcing it in any way that might have given the people affected a chance to respond before it happened. Why does palace access matter this much in the first place? For people outside that world, it might seem like a minor administrative detail, the kind of thing that sounds dramatic in a headline but means very little in practice. Inside the household, it means something considerably more specific. Access of this level isn't simply about being allowed through a door. It reflects trust, proximity, and standing within an institution that treats those 3 things as inseparable from actual influence. The people who lost their access that morning weren't simply friends who occasionally visited. They had standing access specifically because their roles, formal or informal, required regular, unsupervised movement through parts of the palace most people never see. Losing that access doesn't just inconvenience someone's schedule, it sends an unmistakable signal about how the institution currently views their proximity to power. According to someone who has worked inside palace security operations for years, revocations at this level, applied simultaneously to multiple people connected to one individual, are typically reserved for situations involving serious security concerns, or, less commonly, a deliberate institutional decision to limit someone's influence without making a public statement about why. This wasn't a security breach in any conventional sense. Nobody involved had done anything that would normally trigger an emergency revocation, which leaves the second explanation, the deliberate one, as the only version that actually fits what happened that morning. By midday, word had reached enough people inside the household that it was no longer contained to security staff and the 5 individuals directly affected. According to someone familiar with how quickly this spread, at least 2 senior aides had already begun quietly asking each other the same question that would soon reach Camilla herself. What had William learned and when that made this feel urgent enough to act on overnight, without waiting for morning, without consulting anyone above him first? The revelation that started it, 4 days before that first pass failed. William sat alone in a small office at Windsor, reviewing a box of materials that had been quietly compiled as part of an ongoing project to catalog the late Queen's private correspondence. The same broader archival effort that had already produced more than one uncomfortable discovery in recent months. According to someone familiar with how this particular file came to him, it wasn't something he'd specifically requested. It had simply worked its way up through the normal review process, flagged by an archivist who recognized the names involved and understood the sensitivity attached to them. The document at the center of it was a memo, not a letter, written by the late Queen roughly 2 years before her death, addressed to her then private secretary. According to this account, it wasn't drafted in the warmer, more personal tone of the letters that have surfaced in other stories about this family. It read more like an instruction, careful and precise, the kind of document she produced when she wanted something recorded clearly enough that there could be no confusion about her intent later. The memo concerned a specific group of individuals who, at the time it was written, had begun appearing with increasing frequency in Camilla's orbit. According to the person describing its contents, the late Queen named several of them directly, expressing concern about the nature of their access and influence, and instructing her private secretary to monitor the situation closely rather than allow it to expand without oversight. That alone would be significant. What made it considerably more serious, according to this account, was the specific reason behind her concern. The late Queen wasn't simply uncomfortable with Camilla having a wider social circle. She had become aware, through channels the memo doesn't fully specify, of a pattern involving several individuals in that circle using their proximity to Camilla to broker informal business introductions, connecting outside companies and individuals to opportunities within the royal household's commercial relationships, all without going through any of the formal vetting processes that normally govern exactly that kind of access. In plainer terms, according to this account, the late Queen believed certain people close to Camilla had been quietly using their relationship with her, and the access that relationship provided, to operate as unofficial brokers, introducing outside parties to commercial opportunities connected to the royal household in exchange for benefits that were never fully disclosed or formally reviewed. She didn't accuse Camilla herself of orchestrating this. The memo, according to the person who described it, was careful on that specific point, much the way her earlier letter regarding the Sandringham property had been careful to separate Camilla from the conduct of people around her. But she was explicit that the pattern needed to be addressed, and addressed quickly, before it became, in her words, an embarrassment the family would have no good way of explaining if it ever became public. Her private secretary at the time, the same trusted aide referenced in earlier instances of this kind of unresolved instruction, apparently did begin looking into it. According to this account, some preliminary findings were recorded, though the investigation was still incomplete by the time the late Queen's health began its final decline. And like the Sandringham letter, it was never fully carried through to resolution before both the secretary and the late Queen herself were gone. That's the gap William was looking at 4 days before he made his decision. Not a completed, conclusive case. A serious, credible concern documented directly in the late Queen's own words, describing a pattern that had apparently never been fully investigated, let alone resolved, and that, as far as anyone could determine, may have simply continued uninterrupted in the years since. According to someone with knowledge of what William did next, he didn't act immediately on the memo alone. He requested whatever partial findings the former private secretary had managed to record before his death, the same records that had been sitting, like so much else in this story, somewhere between completed and forgotten. What came back, according to this account, wasn't a fully resolved investigation, but it wasn't nothing either. There were notes referencing at least 2 specific instances where individuals within Camilla's circle had reportedly facilitated introductions between outside business contacts and existing royal household suppliers, with no formal record of how those introductions had been vetted or why they'd been permitted to bypass the household's normal procurement review. 2 specific instances, documented but never fully investigated, sitting alongside a memo from the late Queen describing exactly the kind of pattern those instances would represent. That combination, according to someone familiar with how William reacted, is what moved this from a historical curiosity into something he felt required immediate action. There's a detail here worth being precise about, because it shapes everything that followed. William wasn't looking at confirmed wrongdoing in any legal sense. He was looking at a documented concern from his grandmother, partial evidence supporting that concern, and years of apparent inaction that had allowed the situation, whatever its true scope, to continue without any further scrutiny. According to someone close to him, that combination, more than any single piece of evidence, was what convinced him this couldn't simply join the queue of matters waiting for a slower, more formal review. If the pattern the late Queen described had continued unchecked for years, every additional day of unrestricted access for these specific individuals represented, in his view, an ongoing risk rather than a historical one. That reasoning explains the urgency, but it doesn't fully explain why he chose access revocation specifically, rather than some less drastic first step, like simply opening a formal investigation, while access remained unchanged in the meantime. According to someone familiar with his thinking, William apparently believed that approach carried its own risk. If the individuals involved were aware an investigation was forming, and they retained the same level of unrestricted access throughout that process, there would be ample opportunity to alter records, coordinate explanations, or otherwise shape the outcome before investigators ever had a clear, untouched picture of what had actually happened. Revoking access first, before any formal investigation was announced, removed that opportunity entirely. Whatever these individuals had or hadn't done, they would now be doing it from outside the palace, with no ability to access internal systems, internal contacts, or the kind of informal influence that proximity alone provides. That's a defensible strategic decision, viewed purely through the lens of protecting the integrity of whatever investigation followed. It's also, according to people who understand how seriously this family treats matters of personal loyalty and discretion, an extraordinarily aggressive first move, one that effectively treated a documented concern, rather than a proven case, as sufficient grounds for immediate sweeping consequences. William apparently understood that distinction completely, and chose to act anyway. According to someone close to him, his reasoning came down to a simple priority. He would rather risk being seen as having acted too aggressively against people who turned out to be innocent of any deliberate wrongdoing than risk allowing a pattern his own grandmother had specifically flagged as a serious concern to continue unchecked for even one more week, while a formal process slowly worked its way through review. That priority, whether anyone else in the family agreed with it or not, is what set everything in motion the following night. The memo sat finished on his desk. The partial findings sat alongside it, and by the time he picked up the phone to call palace security directly, he had already decided exactly what he intended to do and exactly how quickly he intended to do it. What he hadn't decided yet, according to this account, was whether to tell Charles before acting or after. William moves without Charles. The call to palace security went out just after 9 that evening, according to someone with direct knowledge of how the order was given. William didn't route it through the usual chain of approvals that typically governs changes of this magnitude. He spoke directly with the head of the palace security operations, a conversation that lasted, according to this account, just under 20 minutes. He named 5 individuals specifically. He instructed that their access credentials be revoked effective midnight, processed quietly, with no public notice and no advance warning given to the individuals themselves. He also asked that the revocations be logged under his own authorization, rather than routed through any joint approval process that might require additional sign-off before taking effect. That last instruction matters more than it might initially seem. According to someone familiar with how palace security typically processes a change like this, sweeping revocations affecting people connected to a senior royal usually require at least a secondary confirmation, often from the household office most directly involved, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral action from happening without broader awareness. William's choice to have it logged solely under his own name wasn't an oversight. It was, according to this account, a deliberate decision to take full personal responsibility for the change, rather than involve anyone else in a process he suspected would slow things down, or invite the kind of debate he had already decided he didn't want to have before acting. The security official on the other end of that call reportedly asked one clarifying question before agreeing to proceed: whether Charles's office had been informed. William's answer, according to this source, was direct. Not yet, but he intended to inform his father himself, personally, once the change had already taken effect. That answer alone tells you everything about how William was weighing this decision. He wasn't trying to hide the action from Charles indefinitely. He was choosing to act first and explain afterward, the same approach Anne had taken with the ceremony seating change in the earlier incident this family has already lived through. Whether William was consciously following her example or simply arriving independently at the same conclusion is something nobody interviewed for this story could say with certainty. But the pattern, once you notice it, is hard to ignore. The security official, according to this account, processed the request without further objection. Whatever hesitation existed about bypassing the usual joint approval, it apparently wasn't enough to refuse a direct instruction from William, especially given his increasingly central role in the practical, day-to-day decisions shaping how the institution now operates. That detail is worth sitting with on its own. A senior security official, presumably aware this kind of unilateral action sat outside normal protocol, chose to comply anyway, immediately, without insisting on the secondary confirmation that protocol technically required. That's not simply about following an order. It reflects an underlying assumption, already apparently well established inside the household by this point, that William's authority on matters like this doesn't require the same layers of confirmation that might once have been expected. By midnight, the revocations were live in the system. According to someone familiar with how the household's access infrastructure works, the change wouldn't have been visible to anyone outside the security team itself until the affected individuals actually attempted to use their credentials the following morning, which is exactly what happened a few hours later at that first side entrance. William, according to this account, didn't sleep particularly well that night, which several people close to him have mentioned since, almost in passing, as though it were a small detail rather than a significant one. He understood the consequences of what he'd just set in motion. He understood that by morning, 5 people would discover, in a public and faintly humiliating way, that their access had been cut, and that within hours, word of it would reach Camilla, and from her, almost immediately, to Charles. He had decided that sequence was acceptable. According to someone close to him, his reasoning came down to something he reportedly said directly to one aide that evening, paraphrased here based on this account, that if he waited to inform his father first, the conversation that followed would almost certainly involve some version of asking him to slow down, to reconsider, to let the matter move through a more careful process first. And he had already decided, days earlier, that slower wasn't an option he was willing to choose, given what the memo and the partial findings suggested. That's a significant admission, if accurate. It suggests William didn't simply forget to inform Charles, or assume it wasn't necessary. He specifically avoided informing him first because he anticipated resistance, and he'd already concluded that resistance, however understandable, wasn't going to change his mind about what needed to happen. The following morning, once the first reports of failed access attempts began reaching senior staff, William's office issued a brief, carefully worded internal note confirming the access changes had been authorized directly by him, in connection with what the note described only as an ongoing review of historical concerns regarding household access protocols. No names were mentioned, no further explanation was offered. That note, vague as it was, served one specific purpose. It confirmed, officially and in writing, that this wasn't a mistake, a glitch, or an unauthorized action by rogue security staff. It was a deliberate decision made by William, and he wasn't hiding from it. Charles received word roughly 2 hours after that internal note went out, according to someone familiar with how it reached him. Not from William directly, as William had apparently intended, but through an aide who assumed, incorrectly, that the king had already been briefed given how visibly the situation was unfolding across the household by that point. That gap between William's intention to tell his father personally and the reality of Charles learning about it secondhand instead became its own small but significant complication in the conversation that followed. Because by the time William finally did speak with his father directly, later that same morning, Charles had already heard the basic outline from someone else. And Camilla, predictably, had already come looking for answers of her own. Camilla confronts the king. Camilla reached Charles before William did, according to someone familiar with how that morning unfolded. She'd received a phone call from her stylist just after 8, confused and visibly upset, asking whether Camilla knew anything about why her access had simply stopped working. By the time the second call came in, from the friend who normally joined her for private lunches, Camilla had already started walking toward Charles's private office. According to this account, she didn't wait to be shown in. She walked past the aide stationed outside and went straight in, the same way she had during the earlier incident involving the Sandringham letter. Charles, according to this source, was already aware something had happened by that point, having just received the brief internal note confirming William had authorized sweeping access changes, though he hadn't yet connected it specifically to the people closest to Camilla. Her first words to him, according to this account, weren't a question. They were closer to a statement, delivered flatly. She told him 5 people in her life had lost their access to the palace overnight, all at once, with no explanation given to any of them. Charles reportedly asked her to repeat the names, which she did. According to this source, his expression shifted somewhere around the 3rd name, the longtime friend who had been close to Camilla for well over a decade, someone Charles himself had known socially for almost as long. He told her, honestly, that he hadn't known specifically who was affected until that moment, though he'd received word that William had authorized some kind of access review earlier that morning. Camilla's response, according to this account, was immediate and pointed. She asked whether a review was really what this was, or whether someone had simply decided to punish people close to her without bothering to explain why. That question sat unanswered for a moment, according to this source, because Charles genuinely didn't have the full picture yet. He reportedly excused himself briefly to call William directly, the conversation William had originally intended to have with his father first, now happening in reverse order, with Charles initiating it under pressure from his wife standing in the room. According to someone familiar with that call, William didn't hesitate once his father reached him. He told Charles plainly what he'd found in the late Queen's memo, what the partial findings from the former private secretary's incomplete investigation had suggested, and why he'd decided immediate access revocation was necessary rather than waiting for a slower, more formal process to play out first. Charles reportedly listened without interrupting, the same way he had during the earlier conversation with Anne over the ceremony seating change. When William finished, Charles's first question, according to this account, was whether any of this had been confirmed as more than a documented concern, whether there was actual proof that these specific 5 individuals had done what the late Queen's memo described. William's answer, according to this source, was careful but honest. Not full proof, not yet. The partial findings reference 2 specific instances involving introductions between outside business contacts and royal household suppliers, but the full scope, and which of the 5 individuals were actually responsible for those instances specifically, hadn't been conclusively established. That answer, according to this account, visibly frustrated Charles, though not in a way that suggested he believed William had acted maliciously. He reportedly told William that revoking access for 5 people all at once, based on a documented concern but incomplete evidence, was the kind of decision that needed more care than an overnight phone call to security, regardless of how serious the underlying concern actually was. William, according to this source, didn't apologize for the decision itself, though he reportedly acknowledged the process could have been handled with more communication beforehand. He told his father he stood by the substance of what he'd done, even if he understood the criticism of how quickly and quietly it had happened. Charles returned to the room where Camilla was waiting and relayed what William had told him as accurately as he could, according to this account. He explained the late Queen's memo, the concern about informal business introductions, and the incomplete investigation that had never been formally resolved before both the late Queen and her private secretary were gone. Camilla's reaction to hearing this, according to the source describing it, was sharper than her reaction to the access loss itself had been. She reportedly asked Charles directly whether he believed any of it, whether he thought it was plausible that people she'd trusted for years, in some cases over a decade, had actually been using their closeness to her for exactly the kind of quiet, undisclosed benefit the memo described. Charles's answer, according to this account, mirrored almost exactly what he'd told her during the earlier financial concern raised by Anne. He said he didn't know yet, and that not knowing was precisely why he wasn't going to immediately reverse William's decision, even though he agreed the process itself had been handled too abruptly. That answer, according to the person describing this exchange, landed harder than it had the first time this kind of conversation happened between them. Camilla reportedly told him this was the second time in recent memory that people close to her had been treated as suspects first and explained to second, and she wanted to know how many more times this was going to happen before someone simply asked her directly what she knew, rather than building a case quietly and acting on it before she ever had a chance to respond. Charles, according to this account, didn't have a clean answer for that question. He reportedly told her he understood her frustration completely, and that he intended to ask William directly and clearly to slow down enough to actually speak with her before any further action was taken on this specific matter. Whether that promise was something Charles could actually guarantee, given how quickly William had already demonstrated he was willing to act independently in matters like this, is a question this conversation left entirely unresolved. Camilla left that room, according to this source, without the reversal she'd hoped for, but with at least the sense that Charles intended to push back on the process going forward, even if he wasn't willing to challenge the underlying concern itself. What happened next would depend entirely on whether the formal investigation, finally launched properly this time, found enough to justify what William had already done, or whether it would confirm that 5 people had lost something significant over a concern that, in the end, never amounted to anything provable at all. What the access change confirms. 18 days after that first failed pass, the formal investigation William had ordered alongside the access revocation reached its conclusion. According to someone familiar with the findings, the picture that emerged was more complicated than either the worst version Camilla had feared or the clean vindication William may have hoped for. 3 of the 5 individuals were cleared entirely. According to this account, their connection to the household's commercial relationships turned out to be incidental, friendships and professional associations that had nothing to do with the pattern the late Queen's memo described. Their access was restored within days of that finding, with a personal note from William's office acknowledging the disruption, though notably according to this source, without a direct apology for how abruptly it had happened in the first place. The remaining 2 individuals were a different matter. According to someone with knowledge of the investigation's full findings, the longtime friend and one of the 2 staff members who managed Camilla's personal correspondence were both found to have facilitated multiple introductions between outside business contacts and existing royal household suppliers, exactly the pattern the late Queen had flagged years earlier, and exactly the kind of arrangement that bypassed the household's normal procurement review entirely. The specifics, according to this account, involved a catering supplier and a separate events coordination firm, both of which had secured ongoing contracts with the household after introductions made by these 2 individuals. Introductions that came with what investigators described as informal financial benefits flowing back to the people who'd made them. Arrangements never disclosed to anyone responsible for approving those contracts in the first place. That confirmation changed the entire shape of this story. What had started as a documented concern from a deceased monarch, based on incomplete evidence and years of unresolved suspicion, turned out to be substantively accurate, at least for 2 of the 5 people swept up in William's overnight decision. According to someone close to how this was handled afterward, William didn't treat that confirmation as a moment to claim vindication publicly. There was no statement, no acknowledgement beyond an internal communication confirming that the 2 individuals in question would not have their access restored, and that the matter had been referred for further review regarding the contracts themselves. But inside the family, according to this account, the confirmation settled something that had been sitting unresolved since the morning those first passes failed. William's decision to act immediately, before waiting for a slower, more careful process, had been aggressive, and by his own admission to Charles, imperfectly communicated. It had also, in the end, been substantively right about the 2 people who mattered most. That outcome reframes everything that came before it. Charles's insistence that William slow down and involve Camilla more directly in the process, reasonable as that request was, would have meant extending unrestricted access for at least 2 people who were, in fact, actively benefiting from undisclosed arrangements connected to royal household contracts. Every additional day of access, in hindsight, would have been exactly the ongoing risk William had originally worried about when he chose to act first and explain afterward. Camilla, according to someone familiar with her reaction to the final findings, didn't respond the way she had to the earlier financial concern Anne had raised. There was no pointed question this time about whether Charles believed it. The evidence by this point didn't leave much room for that question to matter. What she reportedly asked instead, according to this account, was how long the friend in question had been doing this, and whether the late Queen had genuinely suspected it years earlier without ever telling her directly. Charles's answer, according to this source, was as honest as it had been throughout this entire situation. He didn't know how long it had actually been happening, only how long it had been suspected. And as for why his mother never raised it with Camilla, personally, he reportedly said he believed she'd intended to handle it quietly through her private secretary, specifically to avoid putting Camilla in the position of having to confront someone she trusted before there was enough evidence to justify doing so. That explanation, according to the person describing this conversation, seemed to land differently than anything said earlier in this entire sequence of events. Camilla apparently sat with it for a long moment before responding, and when she did, her question shifted away from blame entirely. She asked Charles whether he thought she should have noticed something herself over the years, some sign she'd simply missed because she trusted the wrong people for too long. Charles, according to this account, told her that trusting people for years before discovering they didn't deserve it wasn't a failure of judgment. It was simply what happens when you let people close enough to actually matter to you, and that the alternative, treating everyone with permanent suspicion, wasn't a version of her life he believed was worth protecting her from this kind of pain in exchange for. That answer doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't restore the years these 2 individuals spent benefiting quietly from access they hadn't earned honestly. But it does mark, according to people close to the family, a noticeable shift in how this particular chapter resolved compared to the earlier incidents involving Anne and the ceremony or William and the Sandringham property. In those earlier situations, resolution came down primarily to a question of authority, who had the standing to act, and whether anyone above them chose to intervene. This time, the question that mattered most by the end wasn't about authority at all. It was about whether the late Queen had been right, years before any of this became visible to anyone else, and whether acting decisively, even imperfectly, even without waiting for full proof first, had ultimately served the family better than waiting would have. William's decision held, not because nobody challenged it, and not because the process behind it was clean or careful. It held because, when finally tested against actual evidence, it turned out to be substantively correct about the people who mattered most. That outcome, more than the original revocation itself, is what confirms something lasting about William's role inside this family. He's increasingly the one willing to act first, accept the discomfort of being wrong in front of everyone, if it comes to that, and trust that being right often enough will eventually settle the question of whether anyone should have stopped him. So far, nobody has. A quick note here. This story, the access revocation, the memo, the conversations between William, Charles, and Camilla, is a dramatized account built for storytelling purposes. It isn't a documented historical record, and nothing here should be taken as confirmed fact about real events inside the royal household. But what it imagines is worth sitting with anyway. 3 people got their access back, 2 never did. And the late Queen, years before any of this became visible to anyone else, had already written down exactly what she suspected. In a memo nobody acted on until it was almost too late to matter. William moved first and explained later. He got it wrong about 3 people, and right about the 2 who mattered most. That's the part of this story that outlasts the doors themselves, the ones that stopped opening on an ordinary Tuesday morning and never opened again for the people who'd quietly stopped earning the trust that access represented. Being right, eventually, doesn't erase the discomfort of acting before anyone agreed you should. It just means, this time, nobody had a strong enough reason to stop you. If this story pulled you in, let us know in the comments and subscribe for more.